Hi everyone, I'm Adrian Warnock, and I'm here to give a short introduction really to a whole article that I've written this week, in fact a couple of articles I've written this week, about the latest news for COVID-19 and particularly from the sort of immunology side, the infection side, importantly the immunity side if you like. And of course I'm talking about this from very much from a blood cancer patient's perspective, and I've got 6 questions I'm going to quickly answer. That obviously are addressed much more in detail in the articles that I've written. And I hope, though, that for those of you that prefer to listen to something rather than read something, and just to get the sort of general gist of it, there's so much that gets bombarded at us at the moment, and some of it can be rather lacking in hope. And I think this week there's been some quite encouraging developments, some of which we're reasonably confident about, some of which remain a little bit controversial. I'll try and summarise where we're at with that, and paint you a picture of how we're at something of a crossroads perhaps. So first question I've got here is, what is the latest news on vaccines for COVID-19? It's interesting because I think there's been all sorts of conflict about this and different messages about this. Some people have been saying, oh, the vaccines are not working. Other people have been saying, oh, they are working. But in the last week or so, we've had 2 pieces of news. One was from Moderna, and they said that their vaccine had indeed shown some immunological changes, and that's really important. In other words, it produced antibodies. But there was also some leaked news, which we're told will be confirmed in the next 2 days, I believe on the 20th, from the Oxford and AstraZeneca group. And what's almost seemed to have escaped some news outlets is that there are actually tens of millions, in fact hundreds of millions of those doses being produced. And in fact, I think over the next year or so, they have the capacity to produce 2 billion doses of that particular vaccine. And so there's obviously quite a lot of hope beyond that one. And what they're seeing at the moment is that the vaccine is producing antibodies, but it's also producing changes to the T cells. So this is very encouraging because it would suggest that there may be long-term immunity to that vaccine if it does indeed translate into the clinic in terms of not just the changes in the blood, which they've already seen, but also actually preventing the infection or reducing the infection. And certainly that vaccine has been shown to change COVID-19 from a pneumonia-producing infection to a mild cold in monkeys. So that's quite encouraging, and it may be that it will do something similar in humans, although it's worth saying that that monkey study, they actually put so much virus into the monkey. It was a wonder that they weren't infected more. And so actually in a human who had a more normal exposure, it might not even involve a cold. So we don't know at the moment. We're obviously waiting to see over time whether all these vaccines actually prevent the infection or at least reduces the severity of it. But certainly in terms of the antibodies and the T cell changes, that's incredibly encouraging, assuming of course this leak is true, which I hope it is. Now, what I should say about this, of course, from a blood cancer patient's point of view, is unfortunately, we do tend to have a weakness in both producing antibodies and in our T cells not necessarily working as well, particularly after treatment, but even before treatment, that can also be the case. So it remains the case that these vaccines may or may not actually work in people with blood cancer. We obviously won't know until people with blood cancer are given them, but there seems to be an emerging consensus that most of these vaccines will at least be safe for us because they are not live, or they're not considered live. Even though the Oxford vaccine is a virus, it's not a weakened form of the COVID virus, it's a weakened form of a cold virus. So the absolute worst it could ever do would be to cause a cold, but it's been modified in such a way that it can't cause an infection. So a number of people, including some leading blood cancer experts, have gone on record now as saying that they believe that this particular vaccine, and certainly the mRNA vaccines that are also being looked at, should be at least safe for us. Of course, we don't know 100% yet whether this is going to be the answer for us, but there are other things being looked at which I haven't spoken about much in any of my articles, one of which is a monoclonal antibody, a little bit like rituximab, but this would be a monoclonal antibody that would act against COVID-19, and that has a huge amount of promise even for us. So we shall see, but there's some encouraging news there. Next question is, how does the immune changes beginning to be seen with vaccines compare to those seen with natural infections? Now, this is another piece of really encouraging news that has just really come to light in the last week or so, although actually there was some hints of this before. And you see, when it comes to coronaviruses, there has been many of them. And the worry has been, and this has been the case even with some of the studies of humans having been exposed to the current COVID-19, that antibody responses were relatively brief. They would arrive for a few months and then they'd go away again. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter if you've got memory cells produced, because they will then stir up again if it comes back. But also, more importantly, especially for viruses, is these T cells, the T lymphocytes that we don't talk as much about. But again, they're a little bit affected sometimes in people with blood cancer. But what they've now said is that people who were exposed to previous coronaviruses, such as the SARS virus that was about 17 years ago, some of them still have T cells that are active against the SARS virus, even now, 17 years ago, later. And get this is the really encouraging bit, those same patients, the same T cells are actually active against the new coronavirus, suggesting an immunity that goes beyond just a sort of, one species across all of the coronaviruses. And even more excitingly than that, they've discovered that some people who were not exposed to SARS, but presumably had been exposed to some of the coronaviruses that cause colds. So there's actually a lot of coronaviruses circulating in the population around the world over the years that usually we don't even really realize are there because they just cause the cold. Well, some of those patients who've been exposed to those coronaviruses are also, at least to some degree, immune to this current COVID-19. So that's really quite encouraging. So what does that mean? So the next question I've got here is, do we think it's possible to catch COVID-19 more than once? And what does it mean if someone tests positive for antibodies? Well, here, the answer really still has to be, we don't know. But this information about the T cells that I just mentioned would suggest, at least, that perhaps there is going to be some long-lasting immunity. The other thing that would suggest that is the pattern of infection around the world. We are not hearing many cases of people saying, oh, I've had it twice. We're not seeing that. We are seeing some people who have it for a while, get worse, and get better a bit, and then get worse again in quite a short period of time. But what we're not seeing is people becoming well and, say, 6 months later getting ill again. Now, obviously, time will tell. But if someone tests positive for antibodies, at the moment, what people are saying is we don't know. It means that you've had the COVID-19 at some point in the past, and there are some people with blood cancers who've had that and who've survived. I saw a question this week, actually, which really quite saddened me, because someone thought that anyone with a blood cancer who got COVID-19 was guaranteed to die. And we had to quickly say that's not the case, that all of the studies that have been done, all of the case series, no matter how severe, no matter how high risk a group was, even people who have just had chemotherapy, there was no group where the majority of people passed on. The majority of people, even in the highest groups, will actually survive this disease, although it can be quite unpleasant along the way. So we don't know. All we know is that it means that they've had the disease, but we are hopeful that it may mean that they can't get it again. Certainly not quickly, and maybe not for many years. Of course, we're going to have to watch this over time. And it may be that if there is a successful vaccine, we might have to be vaccinated more often. And it may well be that over time, we discover that if you have the antibodies in your blood, then you can't get the disease. But once they go, maybe you could. So we don't know. And again, it's one of those things we're going to have to watch for. So question 4, perhaps a really big question for many of us, certainly for me at the moment, here in the UK, we're seeing a reduction, a genuine reduction in the number of cases at the moment, and it's been ongoing for quite a while. Hasn't gone away, but it's trickling. The numbers are trickling now rather than flooding. Many hospitals don't have anybody in them anymore with this disease. And so the big question is, will there be a second peak, or will this disease gradually melt away? Now, there seems to be 2 conflicting scientific answers to this. One is that, and I'm going to merge in the next question actually, because another question I've got here is, what will it be like in the winter when the flu season starts up and might coincide with another COVID-19 peak? So there is a scientific article that's been published, I think in the last week or so, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but I certainly came across it in the last week, in the UK by a number of scientists who argue the case, and it is just a model, it's just a proposal, it's not guaranteed, but they argue that it could well be that we'll see a huge peak in the autumn, that will coincide with the flu season, and that the NHS will be overwhelmed, and that maybe up to 120,000 people will die, and that it might even be worse than the peak we saw in March. So that's one end of the spectrum, quite a negative view, quite a worrying view. And, certainly, I think if you'd have asked people a few weeks ago, that many people would have been absolutely sure that that was the sort of thing we were looking at. Typically, when it gets cold, people are indoors more. There seems to be this belief that it's going to be much easier to catch indoors, maybe harder to catch outdoors than perhaps we've thought. And so the assumption was, certainly when we started to see London opening up, we started to see even pubs open up about a week or two ago, restaurants opening up. The underground trains have been crowded sometimes even before that. We've seen parks full, we've seen beaches full, we've seen protests, and we've seen all sorts of things going on. And so there's been a sort of general view that, oh, there's definitely going to be another peak. So far there hasn't. And so it's onto this background of where maybe it's not happening. And then also some really fascinating news that seems to have been under the radar somehow. Have you noticed how the media don't seem to like to report the more positive news? Well, quietly in Australia and New Zealand and almost every southern country that I can see, and there's a link on the article to the WHO page on this, but the flu season is almost non-existent in Australia right now and in other similar countries. And the reason for that seems to be the social distancing and not even a full lockdown, because in Australia at the moment, they're not on a full lockdown, but they have had some restrictions. I think schools closed at one point, and they were also obviously implementing a number of social distancing measures. And that, coupled with the lack of international travel, has actually meant that there's almost no flu season happening there. The numbers are ridiculously low. So this is potentially very encouraging for us, because I don't think Australia and New Zealand and some of these other countries are going to be opening up anytime soon for tourists from, you know, Western Europe or certainly not from North America. Sorry, guys. But that could well mean that we might not see a very big flu season, which would be obviously a real mercy because of everything else that's going on. But equally, there is actually this new model that's come out from Oxford and also from another mathematician in the UK. And they were a bit puzzled by some of the things they're seeing and some of the variations in countries, and also just this trend where we're not seeing at the moment a second peak, certainly not in London and certainly not in New York. We are seeing it in some areas where they never really had a first peak. So if you lock down a little early and you never really had a large peak, and then you open up, then yes, you do get a peak. And so really that's still the first peak. And unfortunately, that's true of a number of parts of the US, it would seem, at the moment, although I don't want to get too much into commenting on the US because I don't live there. But what's interesting in this, and this is well worth a read and to understand a little bit more, is that what they were saying is that the models that were initially done worked on the assumption that nobody in the world had any immunity to COVID-19. And that therefore it would just spread and it would spread and it would spread until it reached what you call the herd immunity threshold, which was assumed to be about 60%, and that it might even overshoot that. So we were talking about, that was why there were all those talks about tens and tens of millions of infections in individual countries. You know, 60% of the UK would obviously be a huge number. 60% of the US would be a much even bigger number. And the idea was that you know, really we had to sort of try and prevent it, but that, you know, it might almost be inevitable that such large numbers would eventually get it. And only then, unless we got a vaccine, of course, would we be able to say goodbye to this disease. Now, that's not how SARS behaved, interestingly. It was gone within a few months when it came out. And it's not how some other epidemics have behaved. So this is the real question, and it's the $60 million question, if you like. But what's encouraging is they've put together this idea that some people have T-cell immunity. You might remember I said this earlier. And they put together the idea also that some people have innate immunity. And we all have a bit of innate immunity. What that's talking about is the neutrophils. Those of us who've been through treatment will know very well how important neutrophils are. But one of the things that neutrophils do is they form that first barrier, and they can actually sometimes deal with an infection before we even need antibodies. That's why some people who've been exposed to COVID-19 might not even get antibodies, because the neutrophils and other parts of the barriers, if you like, the innate immune system, might actually be able to fight it off. So what this would mean is that those two things together would mean that actually not everybody in the population has the same vulnerability, if you like, to this disease. And that might help to explain why some old people who you might think are going to get very sick with COVID actually haven't, and they've been fine. And yet some young people who you might think will be absolutely fine with COVID-19 have sadly succumbed. And this could be partly to do with, you know, this alteration in their innate immunity and whether or not they've got these T cells from previous coronaviruses. So this is very encouraging. And what the scientists have now said is, what if we've got a different model? And we look at this idea where actually the most sensitive people, if you like, the most vulnerable people are the ones that initially get it in that initial flood, that initial peak. And then even without a full lockdown, or partly with a lockdown, that could actually flatten that peak. But that what would happen is you would get to the point that as the disease carried on trying to spread, it would find fewer and fewer people who were susceptible, partly because some people had already had it, and partly because some people were actually resistant to it already. So the really encouraging thing about this is it might even be possible that some of us would be in that resistant group, even despite our blood cancer. So it adds to the uncertainty, because essentially what we've got now is, when you ask what's it going to be like in the winter, you've got two groups of scientists saying exactly the opposite. One group saying, don't worry, it's going to just keep going down and down as long as you've already had a peak in your area, which of course not every area has. Another group saying, no, it's coming back. And that's because it's basically an argument about this herd immunity threshold. And the debate is that if there is this variation in susceptibility to the disease, that herd immunity threshold that will stop not necessarily little bits of growth, but will stop the huge epidemics, might only need to be as low as 20%. Whereas if it's not the case that we have that susceptibility, it would be even higher potentially than 50 or 60%. So there we go. That leaves us to a question that I really am not going to answer, but I suppose I should read it out and just have a quick go. And that is question number 6, which is, what should those of us, the last question, what should those of us with a blood cancer diagnosis be doing about this if we live in an area where the disease is growing, or in one which has had a peak and which at the moment is shrinking? So clearly that's a very personal thing. All I'm going to say is that, all the evidence would say we want to do everything we can to avoid catching this. And so obviously if we're in an area where it's growing, then we are probably going to want to take quite extreme measures in some cases to prevent that. But it's a very personal matter, and it depends a lot on what your local authorities are telling you, but it also depends on your own attitude to risk, really, and risk-benefit analysis, and what you want to do. And we could have a discussion about that, and perhaps we can have a discussion about that in the comments section below, or once I finish this talk, this originally came up in one of our weekly calls, and we'll, I'm sure, have a full and frank discussion there. But of course, if you're in an area where it's shrinking, at some point, one might want to start relaxing at least some of those measures. But the question is when, and that's something I'm personally facing myself, and I'm not sure at the moment. I'm watching those figures like a hawk, though, to try and see if there's any hint of this second peak that so many of us are frightened of, or whether indeed the numbers will keep going down. So I guess, in summary, and maybe I could have just said this in one sentence, it's a question of watch this space. I think the next weeks and months will make it very clear to us, firstly, whether the vaccines will work. We'll hear more about that, I'm sure. Secondly, whether or not we can get reinfected with this disease, or people who have normal, healthy immune systems. And thirdly, what's going to happen to the epidemic. What I'm sure about is this, though: it will come to an end. I don't know how quickly, but it will come to an end. So I think we should be full of hope, and I think it's worth reading these things and trying to keep an eye on it, and then trying to make some wise decisions that are suitable for us personally and our own personal sort of values. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'd love to hear more from anyone who's got any further questions or any further comments, and thank you for listening.